cost of a pot of jollof rice in Nigeria and Ghana continues to go up. Here is a new second quarter 2025 report, the crushing cost of a pot of jollof rice from economic think tank SBM Intelligence. We're going to dive into this Q2 2025 report with Ikemesit Effiong, partner, head of research at SBM Intelligence. Ikemesit, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Always a pleasure.
So for those that don't know, for the two people under a rock who don't know what this is about already, explain to those two people, what is the SBM Jollof Index?
Yeah, so it's basically a measure of food inflation. What we do is we take all of the ingredients that goes into making this very popular West African staple, which is jollof rice. So you're thinking rice, onions, pepper, tomatoes, and a protein sauce. In Nigeria, we do it for the statistical mean Nigerian household, which is a family of 5, according to the NBS. For Ghana, a similar number as well. And like you've said, for those who have been on that rock, we've been doing this since 2016. Mm-hmm. We measure this every quarter, and the numbers are not looking pretty.
Yeah. So look, you've got a jollof curve for both Nigeria and Ghana, and the curve is climbing upwards. So you're saying that for both of them, the cost of making these pots, which of course Nigeria and Ghana are rivals in that regard, yeah, there it is. So it continues to go up. So talk to us about these charts that you have.
Yeah. So what you see with the Nigerian jollof curve, right, is that it's a pretty steep climb, but that just illustrates the fact that food inflation in Nigeria just generally is really high. It's very persistent, and it's been continuous, right, for a significant amount of time. I think actually over the last 4 to 5 years. Yeah. With Ghana, you see a bit more volatility, and there's a bit more variance. And that's because Ghana has done a lot more work in terms of making sort of the macroeconomic interventions, right, to moderate and modulate food inflation. Also the fact that this year the cedi is one of the best performing currencies in the world. And just the fact that Ghana is more import dependent from a food inflation standpoint than Nigeria. So external shocks as well as internal dynamics tend to have a very outsized effect on food inflation in Ghana. Yeah,
there's another chart you have where it was really good. I think this goes back to November of 2024 all the way to June 2025. You had the two charts, and then you're like, yeah, perfect. So you are just basically itemizing a number of things that have happened from when the borders were closed, where there was flooding, like in 2022. It's pretty in-depth. So it basically just chronicles what's been happening over the last few years that has driven up food prices.
Yeah, pretty much so. So because we've done this for a while, and we measure these prices, right, in a number of cities. I think in Nigeria, we measure them in 13 markets in 8 cities. In Ghana, we just measure in Accra and Kumasi now. So what we try to do with these charts is just to illustrate also the fact, and this has borne out significantly, not just over this past quarter, but over the past year and a half, like you said, from 2024, the fact that food inflation is also responsive and sensitive to local conditions in the various cities that we measure. So, for example, in the northeast cities, particularly in Bauchi, as you see in the chart there, you've had a situation where the turn in the security situation there forced a lot of farm abandonments, which obviously had an effect on the size of the crop yield. And obviously, as we know, a paucity in supply would have an outsized effect, right, on demand. There were several Nigerian cities, and even in Kumasi, right, where severe weather events last year led to flooding, which obviously affected not just the substance and the quality of the crop yield, but also the ability of farmers to get, those products to market as well. And that led to, those price shocks, particularly in the price of tomatoes, peppers, and some of the other condiments that we measure as well.
Well, it's pretty in-depth. I really enjoyed looking at that chart. Okay, but here's the thing, Ikemesit. I mean, you have a table in your reports that shows this. Inflation has been decelerating, for Ghana, it was like from 55% to like 20-something now. Same in Nigeria. I know we had a rebasing and all that. But so there's the table, and you've chronicled at least from Q1 2023 all the way to Q2 2025. So talk to us about that. I guess, many people say you can't eat inflation or GDP and so on and so forth. But for inflation, it's not what's happening. You're decelerating, but prices. In fact, if we were to chart this with your other chart, you'll see inflation coming down and your Jollof Index going up. So
Yeah, so very, very abridged economics class, right? This is headline inflation. And one of the key things that we're seeing is, first and foremost, headline inflation is movements in the prices of goods stripped out for those volatile products, which includes food. And what you're seeing in Nigeria and Ghana is that decoupling between headline inflation and food inflation.
Yeah.
Right? So while headline inflation is generally coming down, is softening and all of that, food inflation is still very robust and resilient. And in Nigeria, particularly, that's largely a result of more structural issues. You've seen the end, right, to the fuel subsidy, which obviously had an effect in terms of the bump in transportation costs. The security situation in the country is still the way it is. In 2024, we saw that initial sharp price movement to the upside in terms of the currency. It's now come down. It's a bit more stable, but that hasn't passed through yet, right, to those various items, which goes into the calculations, right, for food inflation. In terms of Ghana, there's been a lot more macroeconomic stability, and actually what you've seen is that some of those outside savings, some of those macroeconomic intervention efforts, right, have started to have something of an effect on food inflation, but it's not happening as fast. It's not happening as quickly, right, as you're seeing with headline inflation. So food inflation generally tends to be a laggard. And I think the beautiful thing about the Jollof Index is that it really tells a story about household food security in the end, which could often be different from what's happening in the wider economy.
Makes sense. Makes complete sense. And you know what? This next question, I'm feeling this because I put a request in for some items to be purchased on the market. I mean, for me, it was to make stew. Maybe you do a stew index, but I think stew is also jollof is a derivative of stew. So
yeah, it's highly correlated.
Highly correlated. So you've got a table here, and I mean, for almost everything on that table, looking at the ingredients that go into making a pot of jollof. It's essentially almost double, like salt at the top, 300 naira 2024. By June 2025, it was 566% increase. So that's basically that ingredient table is the story of, I guess, the price, the general pot's price going up. Yeah,
it is. I mean, you're even seeing even sharper and steeper increases in pepper and onions, right? Which for anyone who does his or her shopping, you did not need SBM intelligence to tell you that. You already knew that. The key thing is to recognize that if 4 of the 5 key ingredients, right, move to the downside and represent a savings, but you have an ingredient like in Bauchi, for example, the price of pepper, right, increased by 300%, right, over the course of a year. Those savings correlated with that sharp price upswing will easily cancel themselves out. And that's why our counsel is we need more structural reform in order to address why food in general is becoming a more expensive item and is increasingly occupying a larger share, right, of household spending in Nigeria. We did research first in 2019, we updated it, I believe, in late 2023, early 2024, that showed something like 70% of household spending right now in Nigeria is channeled towards food. And what that simply means is that every other thing, rent, transport, and all of those other key things, right, which you need in order to run a household, are essentially being funded on debt. Right. That accounts for the significant amount of, the significant debt, the significant debts that you're increasingly seeing on the balance sheets of financial institutions. The black tax, anecdotally, we're in the middle of doing some work now that's trying to measure that, right, is anecdotally increasing, right, for many Nigerian households who can't even afford to support extended family, right? And in the end, all of these dovetails around the fact that for food, which everybody needs for sustenance, you can only fast for so long. That's increasingly occupying a bigger, pie of the entire spending decision-making of many Nigerian households.
No pun intended on pie, eh?
I know.
Well
done.
Well done.
I should have said pot.
I know. I should have said that. Okay, so look, the food emergency has been declared out back in 2023. The administration, attempted to pause duties on imports from particular food items. Trying to do things with welfare and so on. What I think that means with the first two, I think I'm addressing, or the second one looking at the price on the supply side. What do we need to do to try and get, I guess, food prices down? Is it a supply issue, or what do you think needs to happen?
Well, it's mostly a supply issue, right? One of the things, and I think the last time I was on your show, I talked about the distinction between food security and food self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
The last two Nigerian administrations and the body language of this current administration also seems to suggest same has been to pursue a strategy of food self-sufficiency, which is basically, can we grow as much, if not everything, right, of what we have? What we argue is that, at least in the short term, there's such a food emergency in the country that we should prioritize food security, which is to bring down the price of food to a sustainable level, either by imports or by some type of substitutionary mechanism. At the very least, to reduce the cushion of the pressure that many Nigerian households are currently dealing with, and while dealing with the structural issues that make crop production in this country just more expensive relative to our peers. So things like improving infrastructure, especially rural infrastructure, right? Secondary and tertiary roads, right, need to be significantly upgraded. No offense to Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, but it's the feeder roads that matter from an agricultural supply chain perspective. We also need to do a significant amount of work around security, right? Insecurity disproportionately affects the main food-growing regions, right? In Nigeria, a lot of our food production is being left on the table. And so in the end, dealing with security, dealing with wider economic reform efforts, in the end would have, that outsized effect, right, on food security. So maybe if we look at, all of our policy making and policy setting and policy decision making from a food security standpoint, and echoing the ethos about us being a food emergency, that may probably put a bit more oomph in the sails of policymakers to do the things that we need to do. Let
me squeeze just one more question out of you. Do you think, with the fuel subsidy removal was a one-time thing. Yeah. We've seen the exchange rates devaluation, looks like another one-time thing. Do you think if we look at the next Jollof Index, that at this point, since we've gotten over those price shocks, do you think that some of these pronounced increase might plateau? Is that possible going forward?
We seem to be approaching that. The rate of increase, right, has been slowing in the Jollof Index over the last couple of quarters. We expect that, right, to remain the case. But two developments will still persist. Yeah. One is we're coming from a very high plateau, right? So many Nigerian households will not feel that slowing, right, in the rate of increase, at least not for a few more quarters. The second thing would be, can we stick and stay the course? Would an external, shock, either geopolitical or geo-macroeconomic, force the government to walk back on some of the important things that they've done on the reform side, especially with the currency and with fuel subsidy? Because that is likely to happen. Yeah. We've seen that happen, right, over the last two administrations. So it's about staying the costs, taking the hit, and continuing to not only message to Nigerians, but also provide support to vulnerable households, especially low-income households, right, in the interim, while we get those structural economic issues on board. I think that should be the game plan going forward, really.
Great stuff. Ikemesit Effiong, partner and also head of research, SPM Intelligence. Here is the report for anyone out there. Download it. Very, very informative. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
An absolute pleasure being with you always.
Solid stuff.